The results are in, and voters have gone Dutch.
The first question is who will become the biggest party? Yeah? We see far-right PVV governing in the last coalition, stepping out, being losing quite some seats. Important signal also for the rest of Europe, I think. And again, opposite of that, we see D66, Liberal Progressive Party, gaining quite some seats. So it's up in the air who will become the biggest party.
But Jan-Paul van der Kerk, senior economist for ABN AMRO Bank, speaking to Bloomberg TV on Thursday morning after the Dutch election results, which went which way, Jamie?
Yes, so with about 98% of votes counted, the centrist Liberal Party, D66, are heading for 26 seats, which is the same number as Geert Wilders' Freedom Party, known as the PVV in Dutch language. So it's a surprise in the extent that Wilders had thought that all of the polling suggested that Wilders was going to win again, but it now looks like he's lost 11 seats. The kind of big shock is D66, this kind of centrist Liberal Party, and they're kind of snapped back into relevance. So they were founded in 1966, hence the name, emerged as kind of radical Democrats, but they've kind of over time they've morphed into a social liberal party. They're pro-European, progressive on rights, very reform orientated on the state and the economy. I think crucially, when it comes to this election, their manifesto really talked about housing. Housing is a big issue, as it is over here in Holland, and they pledged to build 10 new cities to tackle the housing shortage. Really, I guess there's a lot of parallels for UK politics, apart from obviously the crucial thing, which is they have a different voting system. Which
yes, I was going to say, you can draw parallels with the parties, but we would never have a result quite like this.
No, exactly. And so the reason that this election was called was because Geert Wilders pulled his party out of the previous government that he was leading due to the rest of the coalition that he was in not supporting his quite hardline immigration. He had admitted before they went into the election that no one was going to work with him, so it was very unlikely that they would be able to form a government this time. That could be part of the reason why they've lost some support. But I think there's also an argument that actually, having been given power and the kind of governing, they've slightly struggled with the actual act of governing, which we have seen, again, to use parallels, in some of the councils that Reform have been running over in the UK. So it's a very interesting election. We're not yet certain. It will take some weeks before a coalition is decided, but it looks to be led by Rob Jetten, who is the centrist Liberal Party, D66's leader.
Yeah. So, I mean, if the results were just honoured, Harriet, and you took the two biggest parties, it would be the equivalent of, if we are going to make a parallel, sort of Nigel Farage working with Ed Davey, wouldn't it? Which would be unlikely here and is certainly unlikely in Holland as well.
Yeah, so I think that the big takeaway here is how nuts the Dutch political system actually is. My favourite thing that I read about this election was that the ballot papers were so big that the authorities had to design these special containers to put them in before counting them, because there's like 27 parties competing for 150 seats, and there's more than like 1,100 candidates. So it's a big old ballot. But I think another crucial point to take away from this is that Rob Jetten had actually moved this socially liberal party to the right on certain issues, so particularly on issues like immigration. And he had kind of embraced this slightly nationalistic vibe as well. He kind of wrapped himself in the national flag and said that the political establishment had not acknowledged the burden of migration on working class neighbourhoods. So that is that's quite an interesting takeaway here, that I think he himself has rejected this left-right political divide as an outdated concept. And I think that the broader picture as well is that even though we could look at this as an example of where far-right parties actually struggle when they reach government. Like, it's the same thing in all European countries. When far-right or populist parties reach government, they have problems with coalition partners. They have problems with the laws, European laws, and national debts. But they also pull the whole political spectrum to the right. So all the main political parties in Holland have moved to the right, and the kind of the far right continues to dominate the media ecosystem. I think we see that very similarly here and in France as well. So there's just kind of this normalization of far right rhetoric on immigration in particular. Even after Geert Wilders pulled his party out of the coalition still passed really, really, really kind of quite radical anti-immigration legislation. So I think that's the takeaway here. Even if the far right struggles in government, or even if the far right loses, it's pulling everybody to the right.
But that doesn't mean it's pulling everybody, Felicity, does it to the far right? And that's a distinction that a lot of supporters, even of Geert Wilders, would make, right? They'd say, I'm concerned about immigration. And actually, to be fair, the supporters of D66 would at least say, I guess, I'm concerned about the costs of immigration and it's a problem for our country. Mass immigration needs to be refined. So, I mean, it may pull everyone right, but that doesn't mean that they're all far right because they're voting on those issues. It affects Holland like it affects all the major countries in Europe.
Well, I think that's what's so interesting and what has been so successful for Rob Jetten is he hasn't sort of casted anyone who expresses, some unease about immigration as being a fascist far-right nut job. He has talked about, he has described himself as a progressive patriot. And as Harriet was talking about with the flag, they do have concerns about immigration, but they are doing it in a way that is positive. It was a very positive campaign of what do we want this country to look like. They were running a campaign in a time of mass immigration. There were legitimate concerns about this. I think that was what was so successful. It was like, we're not just going to pretend this issue doesn't happen. We accept that there is an issue here, but how do we go about doing this in a way that is, non-racist and positive and progressive, which I think is a really useful blueprint, perhaps, of how parties should approach this issue. And I think it's really, really interesting because I think supporters of Wilders will feel intensely frustrated with him because he had this chance, because he was in a position where, you had a right-wing coalition in power and he kind of blew it, basically. And he allowed for an opening where another party that was seen as way more competent, you have to remember that the right-wing coalition was seen as massively chaotic, loads of infighting. It was negative. That, Wilders himself is very, very controversial. Some of the stuff that he has espoused is definitely racist, really like nasty stuff. And by being so incompetent, it has given way for a new way of thinking about the topic of immigration to come through. And you can't help but see parallels with reform. And when you look at all the recent stuff about Kent Council and how chaotic and how incompetent, I think a lot of people, in this country, they also might have legitimate concerns about migration, but they look at reform and they see negativity and incompetency and chaos and think, do we want that in charge? So I think it has lessons that the UK could take on board, and that's why it's such an interesting story.
Yeah, I think the slogan, Jamie, for DC6 at this election was, "It is possible." But that's maybe a hard slogan to actually deliver on, isn't it? Because the whole reason that right-wing parties are doing well across Europe is they say, it isn't possible. It isn't possible to have mass immigration and have a publicly funded healthcare system, for example.
Yeah, as far back as there's some of the elections that you study at school. Hope has been a big driver for votes, and I think that's what Felicity was saying about the kind of positive campaign that's being run, and the kind of the moderate voters in Holland probably aren't massively opposed to what Geert Wilders' kind of core issue is, but they do see him as destabilizing. But it also, there's an element that makes me think, like when I saw an interview with him just last night, as in when the exit poll came through.
Wednesday night, yeah.
Yeah, so Wednesday night, and he wasn't deflated or disheartened, because I think he ultimately sees the kind of power that being on the outside and as a protest and as a group in that way, that I think it kind of benefits him. If he can't, have outright control, then maybe it's better to be shouting on the sidelines than it is to be in charge. I do agree that the parallels with the UK are really apparent in terms of, what Harriet was saying about, it's mad to me that we were having a discussion last week about comments about whether or not adverts should show, Black and Asian people, that kind of stuff you really thought was in the 1970s, 1980s, but actually now people are having debates about whether that's a legitimate concern, whether they should reflect, adverts should reflect the whole country and stuff. So that Overton window, that it has been moved to the right by all of this, but I think the kind of potentially the hope or the possibility of change is that idea of like, well, if a centrist or slightly liberal party can prove that they're able to give credence to some of the issues that are obviously of concerns to people now in 2025, but are able to do it in a way that isn't chaotic and isn't doesn't feature insurgency and negativity, then potentially there is a way to kind of nip it in the bud in a way.
Maybe, but then the thing is, Harriet, on the internet, these people have a notoriety, don't they, that spreads beyond the nation they're trying to campaign politically in. So, I mean, it's interesting. I can't name any other Dutch politicians apart from Geert Wilders. And, you'd say the same about a lot of MAGA politicians, wouldn't you? They have a prominence way above their standing as senators or whatever. So is the audience even domestic anyway?
Well, this is the problem. Like Wilders, for example, is a bit of a pet of Trump. So like during the NATO summit in June, I think it was, Trump kind of paid him this very high profile visit. He's also the most discussed politician on Dutch television, even though he barely gives interviews. The far right has the stranglehold on the media in France, in Germany, in Spain, in the Netherlands, and in the UK. And you can see that in the disproportionate coverage of far right parties. And because of that, exactly because of that, even so-called centrist politicians are kind of normalizing far right rhetoric. Like, for example, in the Netherlands, the leader of the centre-left, it's like Green, Left, Labour, now joint party, has talked about a refugee problem, and he appeared on a far right TV program. One of the parties was very hesitant to categorize people like demonstrators at The Hague who were performing Nazi salutes. They were very, very, very scared about categorizing that as neo-Nazism, even though Hitler's salutes is quite definitive. And you can see that very much in the UK. But you can also see that even when everybody tries to compete on the same turf as the far right, it doesn't work, because people prefer, like Wilders is going to be more powerful in opposition. He's going to continue to set the agenda. And he's even said so himself. He says being in opposition is a lot of fun and we do it very well. What's interesting about the Netherlands is that one of the main things that stopped Wilders was the EU's asylum laws. So he actually requested an exemption for the Netherlands on an asylum law, and Brussels was just like, no. And the AFD in Germany would have similar constraints, but obviously in Britain, that wouldn't be the situation. Like the far right, if they ever got into government, would be constrained by the markets and by national debts. But parliamentary majority in Britain means that they would have way more power than any Dutch politician could. So I think the lesson here is really one of caution. Like, this is not necessarily just a straightforward victory of a socially liberal party.
In the meantime, though, Felicity, I guess maybe a government that's a bit easier for Starmer and Macron to deal with.
Yes, I'm sure that's true. I mean, obviously a big pro-EU party, so I'm sure lots of left-wing governments across Europe, and certainly the European Union, will be breathing a sigh of relief that they can, probably get more done with this. But I think the fact remains that we still have to see, don't we, really, who's going to actually form the coalition and who's going to be in it and who's going to be the leader and all that sort of thing. So I think there's still quite a long way to go, but I think a lot of people will be relieved that Wilders is out.